She screamed, her face red with rage and her hands shaking with fury as she finally dropped all pretense of civilized behavior. I am Deborah Hawkins. My husband was the mayor of this city. You are nothing but a newcomer who doesn't know his place. The classist undertones of her rant were unmistakable, as was her obvious belief that social status and political connections gave her the right to take whatever she wanted from people she considered beneath her in the social hierarchy. I will make you regret the day you moved into this neighborhood, she continued, her voice becoming more shrill and threatening with each word. You will not be able to live peacefully here until you learn to show proper respect to people who matter. Mrs. Hawkins, I said firmly but calmly, I'm going to keep this contract as evidence of what you just tried to trick me into signing. And I suggest you leave my property now before this situation gets any worse. But Deborah was too far gone to heed reasonable advice or recognize that she was digging herself into a hole that would be impossible to escape. This isn't over, she shrieked, as she finally began to retreat toward the street. You will learn. What happens to people who disrespect the Hawkins family? As she stomped away with Jason trailing miserably behind her, I could hear her on the phone before she even reached her own driveway, and the words I caught made my blood run cold. I need you to file a lawsuit against Derek Coleman immediately. I want him to understand what real power looks like in this town. The die was cast, and I knew that whatever came next would be far worse than anything I had experienced so far. But I also knew that I had evidence of her attempted fraud, recorded threats, and a growing list of witnesses who had seen her true character revealed. If Deborah Hawkins wanted a war, she was about to discover that some battles aren't won by money and connections there, won by truth and evidence. Monday. Morning brought a process server to my door with an official envelope that felt heavier than it should have. Inside the envelope, a lawsuit demanding I hand over my car. The most absurd part was her request for a court order compelling me to allow Jason to use my Porsche if a judge could somehow force me to hand over my property to satisfy her son's transportation preferences. Reading through the legal documents felt surreal, like being pulled into an alternate reality where refusing to lend your car to a stranger's teenager was somehow a criminal offense worthy of massive financial penalties and judicial intervention. She accused me of discrimination, emotional abuse, and anti-community behavior, according to Deborah's version of events. I had been deliberately cruel and exclusionary toward a prominent local family and had caused severe emotional trauma too. A graduating high school student through my inexplicable hatred of young people and successful families. The disconnect between her legal fiction and the reality of what had actually happened was so extreme that I wondered if she had simply invented an entirely different series of events, or if she genuinely believed her own distorted version of our encounters where she was the victim and I was the unreasonable aggressor. Either way, it was clear that she had hired an attorney who was either incredibly gullible or willing to file completely frivolous lawsuits. As long as the client could afford the fees, which in Deborah's case was apparently not a problem. Within 2 days, I had become the neighborhood's #1 enemy, thanks to the rumors she spread. Deborah had launched a comprehensive campaign describing me as an antisocial newcomer, was hostile to community values, and deliberately targeting local families for reasons that remained mysterious but were obviously sinister. Her story grew, more elaborate and dramatic with each telling, transforming our simple disagreement about car borrowing into an epic tale of persecution and discrimination, where she played the role of an innocent victim being tormented by a cruel and unreasonable neighbor. The effectiveness of her campaign was both impressive and disturbing, as neighbors who had been friendly just days before suddenly became cold and distant whenever they saw me, apparently convinced that I was some sort of monster who took pleasure in ruining graduation celebrations. I found myself isolated in my own neighborhood, treated like a pariah for the crime of refusing to hand over my car keys to a stranger's teenager at the graduation. Deborah used the crowd to spread her victim narrative, but Jason was caught on video telling a friend, "This is embarrassing. I never wanted that car." The clip changed everything. Jason arrived at the ceremony driving his mother's aging Buick, clearly embarrassed by the attention. His mother's campaign had drawn to their family's transportation situation and the public nature of their conflict with me. From my position working at the stadium where the ceremony was held, I could see Deborah holding court with other parents, gesturing dramatically as she undoubtedly recounted her version of our conflict for anyone willing to listen to her increasingly elaborate tale of persecution. But her theatrical performance began to backfire when an unexpected piece of evidence emerged that contradicted her carefully constructed narrative and revealed the truth about Jason's actual feelings regarding the entire situation. Another parent at the graduation ceremony had been recording their own child's achievement when they accidentally captured Jason talking to a friend near the parking area. And in that unguarded moment, Jason said something that completely undermined his mother's entire legal strategy. The parent who recorded this conversation was someone who had initially been sympathetic to Deborah's story. But hearing Jason's honest assessment of the situation made them question everything they had been told about the conflict and wonder if they had been manipulated into taking sides in a dispute they didn't fully understand. When they shared the video with other parents, it quickly spread through the community's informal communication networks, raising serious questions about whether Deborah had been truthful about her son's feelings and motivations throughout this entire ordeal. As Jason's contradictory statements spread through our neighborhood, the tide of public opinion began to shift in subtle but noticeable ways that suggested people were starting to see through Deborah's manipulation and recognize the truth about what was really happening. Some neighbors began to reach out to me privately, expressing doubts about Deborah's version of events and asking for my side of the story. These conversations revealed that I wasn't the first person in our community to experience Deborah's aggressive tactics when she didn't get her way, and several neighbors shared stories about similar incidents where Deborah had used intimidation and social pressure to force compliance with her various demands. The final escalation came when Deborah's attorney called me directly with what they described as a final settlement offer that would allow me to avoid the expense and uncertainty of going to trial. The terms were exactly what I expected. I would allow Jason to use my Porsche for one day, make a public apology, and pay $5,000 to cover their legal expenses. In exchange, they would withdraw the lawsuit and allow me to remain in the community without further legal action. I declined their offer immediately, knowing that giving in to extortion would only encourage more of the same behavior from people like Deborah. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to fight for the principle that property rights still matter in America, even when dealing with entitled neighbors who think money and connections can buy them anything they want. The day of our court hearing arrived with all the drama and tension of a major legal battle. Even though the underlying dispute was as petty as any conflict could possibly be, and Judge Clark presided over a courtroom that was unusually packed for what should have been a simple civil dispute. Neighbors from our community filled the gallery seats like spectators at a sporting event, eager to witness the resolution of a conflict that had divided our neighborhood and dominated local gossip for weeks. She came dressed to impress, as if overdressing could win a case. Her attorney, Mr. Peterson, carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to winning cases through reputation and connections, rather than facts and evidence. On the other side of the courtroom, I sat with my own attorney, wearing a simple white shirt and conservative tie, carrying nothing but the truth and the evidence I had carefully collected during Deborah's escalating campaign against me. The contrast between our approaches was obvious. She came armed with expensive suits and theatrical confidence. I came prepared with facts and documentation. He portrayed me as classist and cruel. It was a performance. According to his narrative, I had refused to participate in a reasonable community tradition, causing emotional distress through my discriminatory behavior motivated by jealousy of their social status. He described Jason as a promising young man whose graduation had been destroyed by prejudice, making it sound like I had personally ruined Jason's entire future rather than simply declined to lend my car to someone I barely knew. His presentation was smooth and professional, but completely divorced from the reality of what had actually happened between Deborah and me. When Deborah took the witness stand to tell her version of events, her performance was like watching a politician campaign for mayor, complete with carefully timed pauses and emotional breaks designed to maximize sympathy from anyone who hadn't witnessed her true behavior during our actual encounters. She described our initial meeting as a friendly neighborhood conversation, where she had made a reasonable request for community cooperation, only to be met with hostility and discrimination that left her shocked and heartbroken by my inexplicable cruelty toward her family. According to her testimony, I had been deliberately cruel in my refusal and had made insulting comments about her family's social status and her son's worthiness, painting me as some sort of classist monster who took pleasure in tormenting grieving widows and their children. Her voice trembled with apparent emotion as she described the devastating impact my refusal had on their family's graduation celebration, creating a narrative where she was the victim of inexplicable cruelty rather than someone who had attempted fraud and intimidation when she didn't get her way. But the foundation of Deborah's carefully constructed narrative began to crumble when my attorney began presenting the evidence I had collected during her campaign against me. We showed the fraudulent contract and expired insurance. The judge wasn't amused. The fraudulent papers were submitted as exhibits, along with expert testimony about their deceptive nature and the complete non-existence of the insurance company she had claimed to cover any damages to my vehicle. The fraudulent rental contract, that was actually a disguised ownership transfer document, was presented with a legal expert explaining exactly how signing it would have temporarily given Jason legal claim to my portion, potentially made it impossible for me to recover my own property. These documents painted a very different picture of Deborah's intentions and methods, suggesting someone who was willing to commit fraud rather than accept a simple refusal from a neighbor who had every right to decline her unreasonable demands. The most devastating evidence came when Lydia Turner took the witness stand to describe what she had observed and recorded during Deborah's visits to my home, providing testimony that was calm, detailed, and supported by video evidence that captured Deborah's true behavior when she thought no one important was watching. The recordings clearly showed Deborah making threats, attempting to pressure me into signing suspicious documents, and becoming increasingly aggressive when her manipulation tactics failed to work as expected. Most damaging was the audio of Deborah explicitly stating that she intended to make me regret refusing her demands and that she would teach me a lesson about respecting people of her social status, revealing the vindictive motivations behind her legal action. Lydia also testified about Deborah's history of using similar intimidation tactics against other neighbors who had crossed her, establishing a pattern of behavior that suggested this lawsuit was simply the latest escalation in a long history of bullying and manipulation when she didn't get her way. Judge Clark's reaction to the evidence was visible and telling, with his expression growing increasingly skeptical as the true nature of Deborah's behavior became clear through witness testimony and documented evidence that contradicted every aspect of her victim narrative. When he examined the fraudulent documents Deborah had tried to get me to sign, his disapproval was obvious and immediate, and his questions to Deborah became increasingly pointed and difficult to answer. As the hearing progressed and more evidence was presented, Deborah's composure began to deteriorate visibly. With her carefully maintained facade cracking under the pressure of having her true behavior exposed in a public forum where lies and manipulation couldn't succeed, when Judge Clark announced that he wanted to hear from Jason himself about his actual feelings regarding the situation, the color drained from Deborah's face as she realized that her carefully constructed narrative was about to face its ultimate test from the one person whose testimony she could never dismiss. The moment when Jason Hawkins stood up to address Judge Clark will forever be remembered as the turning point where truth finally triumphed over manipulation and intimidation. His hands were trembling as he walked to the witness stand, but his voice was clear and steady when he began to speak. "Your Honor," he began, looking directly at the judge rather than at his mother, "I need to tell the truth about what really happened and what my mother has been doing to Mr. Coleman." The silence in the courtroom was absolute as everyone waited to hear what the alleged victim of my cruel discrimination had to say about our conflict, and what followed was a devastating dismantling of every claim Deborah had made, delivered by the one person whose testimony she could never discredit. Jason's confession revealed the disturbing reality of how Deborah had manipulated him and the entire situation for her own purposes, using his graduation as an excuse to wage a personal vendetta against someone who had dared to refuse her demands. She told me people like Mr. Coleman need to be taught their place, Jason explained, his voice growing stronger as he continued. He described how Deborah had coached him on what to say and how to act during their visits to my house, always emphasizing that we were the victims and I was the unreasonable aggressor who needed to be taught. A lesson about respecting his social superiors. Most damaging was his revelation that he had never actually wanted to borrow my car in the first place, but had been pressured by his mother into participating in her escalating campaign against me because she couldn't tolerate the humiliation of being refused by someone she considered beneath her social status. I never wanted the car. I just wanted to avoid her wrath. Jason continued, his voice breaking with emotion as he described the years of manipulation he had endured, but she said that wasn't good enough, that I deserved better, and that Mr. Coleman needed to learn his place in our community. The courtroom erupted when Deborah could no longer contain herself and jumped to her feet, screaming at her own son in front of the judge, jury, and packed gallery in a display that destroyed any remaining credibility she might have possessed. Jason, what are you doing? She shrieked, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered as she realized her own son was destroying the case she had spent so much time and money constructing. I did everything for you. I fought for you. How can you betray me like this? Her outburst was so violent and inappropriate that Judge Clark had to bang his gavel repeatedly and threaten her with contempt of court charges if she didn't immediately sit down and remain silent. But Deborah was beyond rational control at this point. She was consumed by rage and disbelief that her own son would dare to contradict the narrative she had invested so much in creating. Her reaction revealed the entitled, manipulative person she had always been underneath her polished exterior. I raised you to be better than this, she continued, screaming, pointing an accusing finger at Jason while completely ignoring the judge's demands for order. I gave you everything. I deserve loyalty and respect. Jason mentioned that his mother had sued other neighbors before, always finding ways to make them look bad when they didn't comply with her demands. He explained how Deborah had taught him to view their neighbors as either allies or enemies based solely on their willingness to submit to her wishes, and how she had convinced him that social status and political connections gave them the right to expect special treatment from everyone around them. Most heartbreaking was his admission that he had been embarrassed by his mother's behavior for years, but had been too afraid of her anger to speak up until now, when he finally found the courage to tell the truth about what she had done in his name. The pattern was clear. This wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign of intimidation and harassment that had been going on for years. The arrival of Officer Gary Mills with additional evidence against Deborah provided the perfect climax to what was already a devastating day for her legal case and public reputation. As he entered the courtroom carrying a thick folder of documentation that painted an even more disturbing picture of her behavior, Officer Mills testified that Deborah had filed 12 false police reports in the past 18 months, mostly targeting neighbors who had crossed her in some way, using law enforcement as a weapon against people she didn't like. Mrs. Hawkins has a documented pattern of calling us with dramatic stories about threatening behavior or suspicious activities. Officer Mills explained in his professional manner that made his words even more damaging. We've investigated multiple complaints from her that turned out to be completely fabricated, and several neighbors have expressed fear about being targeted by her if they don't comply with her various demands. He described how Deborah would manufacture emergencies and invent threats to punish people who had disappointed or opposed her, turning the police into unwilling participants in her campaigns of harassment and intimidation. When faced with the overwhelming evidence of her fraudulent documents, false police reports, intimidation tactics, and now her own son's testimony against her, Deborah's final meltdown was spectacular in its completeness and disturbing in its intensity. She stood up again despite Judge Clark's warnings and launched into a tirade that revealed the entitled, manipulative person she had always been underneath her polished exterior, screaming accusations at everyone in the courtroom who had contributed. To her humiliation, she shouted, "This entire courtroom is corrupt," gesturing wildly at everyone around her like a deranged dictator addressing imaginary enemies. You're all jealous of people like me who have status and influence. You can't treat me like this. Her rant continued with increasingly unhinged claims about conspiracies against wealthy families and demands that everyone recognize her superiority and importance, creating a spectacle that was both pathetic and disturbing to witness. Judge Clark's patience finally reached its breaking point as Deborah continued her outrageous display. His response was swift and decisive. Mrs. Hawkins, this court has seen enough of your disruptive behavior and frivolous claims, Judge, Clark said firmly. His final verdict was delivered with the kind of judicial authority that left no room for argument or appeal, his words cutting through the courtroom tension like a sword of justice that had been waiting months to fall on someone who richly deserved it. This court finds that the plaintiff's case is completely without merit and appears to be motivated by personal vendetta rather than legitimate legal grievance. He announced, his stern gaze fixed directly on Deborah as she sat trembling in her defendant's chair like a child who had been caught in an elaborate lie. Mrs. Hawkins, you were ordered to pay $25,000 in sanctions for filing a frivolous lawsuit, plus an additional $15,000 to cover Mr. Coleman's legal fees and expenses. The monetary penalties were substantial enough to get anyone's attention, but Judge Clark wasn't finished delivering consequences for Deborah's months of harassment and intimidation that had terrorized our entire neighborhood. Furthermore, this court is issuing a restraining order prohibiting you from contacting or approaching Mr. Coleman for a period of 3 years. And your case is being referred to the prosecutor's office for investigation of multiple false police reports. A gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the silent courtroom. And I knew that justice had finally been served to someone who had spent years believing that money and social status placed her above the law. Mrs. Hawkins, he said, with a slight smile that suggested he was genuinely enjoying this moment of poetic justice, are certainly welcome to appeal. But I strongly advise you to find better uses for your money than continuing this frivolous litigation. The laughter that rippled through the courtroom at his dry response was the perfect soundtrack to Deborah's humiliation. And I could see her face turning an even deeper shade of red as she realized that everyone was laughing at her rather than, with her own experience that was probably completely foreign, someone who had spent decades being treated with undeserved deference and respect. Her threats had become increasingly incoherent as the reality of her complete defeat began to sink in, but Judge Clark had heard enough of her disruptions and delusions of grandeur. The moment everyone had been waiting for arrived when Officer Mills approached Deborah immediately outside the courtroom doors, handcuffs ready and warrant in hand for her arrest on charges of filing multiple false police reports over the past 18 months. Deborah Hawkins, you are under arrest, Officer Mills announced in his calm, professional voice, the words echoing through the courthouse lobby as dozens of spectators watched the dramatic conclusion to months of legal theater and community drama. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The click of the handcuffs closing around Deborah's wrists was audible in the suddenly silent lobby, and the sight of her being led away in custody provided a satisfying conclusion to her campaign of intimidation and harassment that had made its life miserable for so many people in our neighborhood. Even in handcuffs, she continued protesting her innocence. But her voice was growing fainter as Officer Mills guided her toward the exit and her long overdue encounter with real consequences for her years of bullying and manipulation. The walk of shame that followed was perhaps the most cinematically perfect ending to any conflict I have ever witnessed. As Deborah was escorted through the courthouse lobby past dozens of neighbors and community members who had gathered to witness the conclusion of our legal battle and see justice finally served. Her expensive clothing looked absurdly formal for someone being arrested, and the contrast between her affluent appearance and her criminal situation created a visual metaphor for the justice that was finally being served to someone who had believed herself above the law. I am the victim here, she continued, screaming as Officer Mills led her toward the police car with the patience of someone who dealt with plenty of difficult arrestees. This is all a conspiracy against people like me. But her protests fell on deaf ears, and the crowd of spectators watched in fascinated silence as she was helped into the back of the police cruiser, finally facing consequences for behavior that should have been stopped years ago. Some neighbors were recording the scene with their phones, capturing the moment when Deborah Hawkins finally faced justice for her years of bullying and intimidation. Mrs. Patterson approached me with obvious embarrassment. She was so convincing. And she seemed so respectable, she said, shaking her head. I never imagined she would lie about something like this. Jason's personal redemption began when he approached me after his mother's arrest, tears streaming down his face. Mr. Coleman, he said in a voice breaking with emotion, I am so incredibly sorry for everything my mother put you through. You taught me that it's possible to stand up to bullies, even when they're your own family members. I'm going to live with my aunt in another state and start over. Our conversation that day was one of the most meaningful I had during the entire ordeal. As Jason explained how he had finally found the courage to break free from his mother's manipulation and choose truth over family loyalty. The immediate aftermath brought apologies from neighbors who had been manipulated. But we all understood that healing would take time. 1 week after Deborah's arrest and subsequent departure from our neighborhood, we gathered the white Porsche. Sat under a banner, bought, not borrowed. Lydia raised a toast. And we celebrated not just my victory, but the entire community's liberation from someone who had terrorized us for years with her entitled behavior and legal threats. Children played safely while adults shared stories and rebuilt the connections that Deborah had tried so hard to destroy with her manipulation and intimidation tactics. The atmosphere was one of genuine relief and renewal, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted from our neighborhood and allowed the sun to shine through again. As the sun set behind our peaceful suburban neighborhood and the barbecue party wound down to a perfect conclusion, I reflected on the lessons learned from this bizarre and exhausting experience with someone who thought money and social status gave her the right to control other people's lives and property. The white Porsche sat gleaming in my driveway, still beautiful, still mine, and now somehow even more precious, because it represented the principle that some things cannot be bought, borrowed, or stolen through intimidation. Deborah Hawkins had learned an expensive lesson about respect being something you earn through treating others with dignity, rather than something you can demand. Our neighborhood was more peaceful than it had been in years, and if you've ever had to stand up to someone who thought they could bully you into submission, remember this? Saying no is not only your right, but sometimes your responsibility. To protect yourself and others from people who mistake wealth and status for wisdom and character. You watched it, you felt it. Now share it with someone who loves drama even more than you. The weeks that followed Deborah Hawkins' courtroom downfall became a time of transformation for the entire neighborhood. For years, she had held an invisible leash around the community, manipulating opinions, weaponizing relationships, and turning neighbor against neighbor through whispered rumors and veiled threats. But now, with her arrest making headlines and her name attached to terms like fraud, false police reports, and public meltdown, her influence disintegrated faster than anyone expected. The neighborhood that once walked on eggshells around the Hawkins name was finally breathing freely again. What had once been a fractured community, divided by fear and favoritism, was slowly stitching itself back together. No block parties returned. This time, not as exclusive affairs with Deborah at the center, but as genuine gatherings filled with laughter and healing. It started with a small get-together at Lydia Turner's backyard. The same woman who had bravely testified and exposed Deborah's manipulative games. Her quiet courage had inspired others to speak up. And her invitation read, "No more fear, no more favorites, just neighbors." Nearly every household showed up. Jason, now living with his aunt in a neighboring state, kept in touch through occasional phone calls and handwritten letters. In his last message, he wrote, "Mr. Coleman, I can't thank you enough. You stood up when I couldn't. I'm studying pre-law now. I want to help people who are afraid to speak the truth." It was a redemption arc no one had seen coming, and it touched everyone who had watched the trial unfold. Meanwhile, the local news media ran a short documentary called The Hawkins Effect, detailing the rise and fall of a woman whose misuse of power taught an entire community a lesson in resilience. Interviews with neighbors highlighted a recurring theme. They had felt trapped for years, but didn't realize how much until the chains were finally broken. The footage of Deborah being let out in handcuffs became a symbolic moment that represented far more than just one woman's downfall. It was the exorcism of years of anxiety, coercion, and intimidation. As weeks turned into months, the tangible results of the courtroom victory began to materialize. The HOA board was completely restructured with new bylaws preventing any one person from having unilateral influence. A neighborhood ombudsman position was created, a direct result of the Hawkins cast to act as a check against future abuses of power. And perhaps most symbolic of all, the street outside Deborah's former home was renamed from Hawkins Way to Harmony Lane. A unanimous vote passed by the neighborhood council, Derek Coleman, the quiet but determined man at the center of it. All became something of a local legend, not for his wealth, nor for flamboyant acts, but for the unwavering calm and strength he showed in the face of absurd injustice. Kids who once avoided him out of fear now waved when they saw him gardening. Parents asked his opinion at town meetings. He had earned the most valuable thing in any community, trust. On the one-year anniversary of the court ruling, Lydia hosted another gathering, this time in Derek's honor. She placed a simple banner that read, "Truth wins." There were no toasts, no speeches, just warmth, shared food, and quiet acknowledgments of how far they'd all come. And parked in the driveway, gleaming as ever, was the white Porsche. Not as a symbol of status, but of principle. A reminder that some things are worth standing up for, even when the odds feel impossible in the end. Deborah's downfall didn't just restore balance. It created a new, stronger, more unified neighborhood. One that knew the dangers of unchecked influence. One that knew how easily silence can be bought, and how powerful a single voice of truth can be. The story of Derek and Deborah became more than just gossip. Fodderette became a cautionary tale, a community parable, and most importantly, a testament to what's possible when ordinary people choose courage over comfort. And so the streets of Harmony Lane remained peaceful, not because everyone always agreed, but because they had learned the cost of letting fear dictate their actions. As for Derek, he continued living quietly, never seeking credit, but always ready to stand up when it mattered. After all, justice doesn't always wear a robe or bang a gavel. Sometimes it wears gardening gloves, drives a white Porsche, and knows when to simply say, no. The end.